Hello, everybody. Um, we're going to start talking about the second phase of the Cold War, which is going to start shortly after the Soviet Union acquires the atomic bomb, which we talked about a little bit in the last phase. This uh, this phase of the Cold War is going to cover the terms of a few different presidents, starting with Harry Truman, and then Dwight Eisenhower, and then John F. Kennedy. It's going to there's going to be several important events that occur as Americans and Soviets are worried about a nuclear conflict that might occur. And so this will cover the space race, this will cover the arms race, the Cuban Missile Crisis. A lot of very important events are going to occur at this time. And the America is changing rapidly. The Soviet Union is changing rapidly during this time. The Vietnam War will get going before people even know there's an actual war. It's going to kind of start taking place. So there's a lot of interesting things that occur during the Cold War during this era. You take a look at the Soviet Union. All right, what does it stand for? The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. Many of these are their own countries today. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, probably said that one wrong, and Russia. Russia was the largest of these republics. And the people that live in these places are very different from each other, but the Russians were in charge of this whole area. So when the Soviet Union broke apart in the early 90s, these places all gained independence. So this is where we kind of ended last time, where Russia acquires the atomic bomb and it rattles people in the United States. We are no longer the only superpower in the world with the atomic bomb. People are worried, hey, what could happen if we get into a nuclear war? That type of thing. One of the things that starts happening is fallout shelters become something that many people start building. Think of our doomsday preppers that you see in on TV today. Now, not everybody had these, but there was something that if you had some money, you might be building fallout shelters. And so you've got people that are living, or they have a almost like a little basement underground on their property at their house, where they have it stocked full of food and things like that. So that was something that some people did, not the majority, but some people, thinking that they needed to build this to survive a nuclear attack. You can kind of see, like, here's a design for one where it would be dug into the side of a hill. Life magazine. New facts you must know about fallout. The drive for mass shelters. 1962. Do it yourself. How to build one. You could purchase it and they deliver the supplies. You might see old signs sometimes around fallout shelters where maybe it was a certain building. I remember when I was in college at the University of Minnesota Morris, there were some old buildings from the 60s that still had these signs up. And you would basically, it was like the hallways in the middle of these buildings, or these staircases that kind of were in the middle of the building. That's where you would go if there was a nuclear attack. We, of course, were not worried about nuclear attacks back in the early 2000s, but they were left there from the 60s and 70s and 80s. You might see this movie. I haven't seen it on TV or anything in a long time, but it wasn't a bad movie. You had Brendan Fraser, who grew up in basically a fallout shelter for like his first 30 years of life. They went down there, his parents did, and then he comes back up in the 90s. So blast from the past. Well, I'll show you a duck and cover video later, but essentially they were teaching kids in school to duck and cover. And Truman, President Truman, his line was, "Education is our first line of defense," meaning we need to train our population what to do in case there's an attack. Students practiced drills. They got under desks. They got under tables. Duck and cover. And Bert the Turtle was the star of these films. Talked a little bit about this when we talked about NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, being signed. The response to the Soviets was to create the Warsaw Pact. And this was an alliance between the Eastern European nations and the Soviet Union. So your communist countries in the East, countries like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Albania, Yugoslavia. So now you see two sides. Or Poland was another one. Warsaw is in Poland. And so you have your communist countries against your democracies. And you can kind of see it right here. Eastern Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Albania are all communist countries here. The first big conflict that's going to start off in this era, and President Truman is in charge, is the Korean War. The Korean War was fought from 1950 to 1953, and this is back when Korea was basically one nation of people. There wasn't a North and South Korea yet, and Korea had been taken over by Japan during World War II. Before that, it was controlled by China. So it hadn't been an independent country where it didn't have to listen to anybody before. And so after the war, it was kind of set up that the North Korea would kind of help get back on its feet, or the northern part of the Korean Peninsula would get back on its feet, and China and the Soviet Union would help with that. The democracies would help down here. And what we start seeing is all of a sudden North Korea kind of has a leader that's going to follow the Soviets. South Korea has leaders that are going to follow countries like the United States. And the goal has always been to put these two back together. It still is today, 2020. South Korea would love to join up with North Korea and be one big democracy. North Korea would love to join up with South Korea and be one big dictatorship. And the two sides can't agree on that. North Korea is going to invade South Korea. And it's going to be a big attack. And you can see here, political cartoon, Harry Truman dragging the United Nations. Basically, the United Nations is brought in. Troops from around the world are going to fight. The vast majority of the troops, though, are Americans. So technically, this is never actually a war, even though it is a war. There's fighting, there's bombs going off, people are dying. It's a war, but not officially, because the United States never declares war on anybody. This was a United Nations conflict. So oftentimes, even though it's the Korean War, people will call it the Korean conflict. Because if you remember back to civics, who has to declare war on another country? Not the executive branch, not the president. Congress does, and Congress never does. So he's dragging the United Nations to war. You can see over here, League of Nations never stopped a world war. The United States never joined it. In memory of League of Nations, died of lack of exercise. The United Nations is getting started in 1945. They are working on stuff in 1950. U.S. provided the most soldiers and supplies, and it was one of the bloodiest wars in history. So we're talking about a fairly major conflict 5 years after World War II. At first, it was called the police action in North Korea because the United Nations was playing the military role. The United Nations was in charge. Today, the United Nations is still out there trying to keep the peace. If you see movies or pictures or documentaries or news clips online, the United Nations is always kind of this baby North Carolina blue color is kind of their symbol. So just some photos. Notice they're walking in the snow. It is mountainous there. We'll see this clip later. The 38th parallel is the line that separates North and South Korea. So this is a line of latitude. It's the border. You can see the sign. You are now crossing the 38th parallel. So just taking a look at how it kind of went, is North Korea was overrunning South Korea here in 1950. All right, June to September. It looked like they were almost. This is the South Korean troops. The pink area or peach area represents North Korea. They almost overran and took the whole peninsula over. The United States gets involved, led by Douglas MacArthur, that you see here. You might remember him from the World War II unit. He was in charge of the Pacific. He always wore the aviators, kind of had that corncob pipe in his mouth. He went back to the Philippines. He has kind of a daring plan, and it works out. Kind of they kind of sneak through, kind of a naval invasion, and they drive the North Koreans all the way back. And at this point, looks like it's going to be a big victory for the United Nations. Maybe South Korea will, the people that the United Nations, the United States had put in charge in South Korea, looks like they may take over this whole peninsula, which certainly would change history right now. You won't have Kim Jong-un is in charge. His grandfather was in charge of North Korea at this time. He was kind of their first leader. And then all of a sudden, North Korea is going to get a little help from their friends up here, China. A whole bunch of Chinese soldiers are going to invade and cross into North Korea, across the mountains. MacArthur thought they'd be home by Christmas, and that's September to November. So China launched an attack to help North Korea. It looked at this time like the United Nations was going to liberate North Koreans. And all of a sudden, they drive the American and United Nations troops back across the 38th parallel. So it's November 1950, February 1951. They drive them back across. And then the United Nations, United States troops fight back. You had 1 million Chinese troops cross the border here. So this is February 1951. We're talking about a full year or so of fighting going on. Maybe not quite a full year. And it's kind of the stalemate occurs at the 38th parallel, that original border. Truman orders U.S. troops not to cross the 38th parallel in 1951. He says, basically, we're at where we started. This was the goal. All right, do not allow North Korea to take over South Korea. That was the goal, containment. Don't allow communists to spread. We've accomplished our goal. Just hold pat. Well, Douglas MacArthur, general in charge of the United Nations forces during the Korean War, does not listen. He wants to go across the border. He was thinking we could use atomic bombs and maybe bomb China. And this could set off a pretty big, war if the Soviet Union decides to join. And so he wants to cross the 38th parallel. And a very controversial decision is made by Harry Truman. He decides to fire Douglas MacArthur. This is a hero of World War II. This is somebody that most Americans looked up to, a larger-than-life figure, and the president just fires him. And like Harry Truman said, if you read his book, it's pretty good. I had to read it in AP history, I believe, back in school, Mr. Pulse's class. And Harry Truman said, I didn't fire him because he was a dumb bleepity bleep. And I won't say the word here because it's on the internet now. But I didn't fire him because he's a dumb bleepity bleep, son of a bleep. He said, I'm firing him because he won't listen to the president. And that's how MacArthur gets fired. And it's pretty controversial. He just basically said, hey, he's not listening to the commander-in-chief. He's fired. March 1951 to 1953, kind of just that stalemate at the 38th parallel. MacArthur fired MacArthur to avert general war, Truman says, and bid for North Korea. Truman took a lot of heat for this. Basically, no land is exchanged in the end. We just kind of see our same 38th parallel right here. Here was the start. MacArthur fired, not popular decision. We'll see this video later on. But basically, Truman's firing MacArthur because he doesn't want to start a nuclear war. Bob Hope, famous comedian, did a lot to keep the troops entertained. Marilyn Monroe, famous actress. Today, that strip at the 38th parallel is known as the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. It is probably one of the most heavily armed, guarded borders in the world. There are millions of landmines throughout here. There are soldiers on both sides. The United States, we still have a military base here. We still have 30,000 troops stationed in South Korea, right on the border. And so you'll hear a lot about this. Some of you might join the military. You might get stationed there. They're always on heavy alert, even though probably nothing's going to happen. MacArthur's famous quote when he returned to the United States: "Old soldiers never die. They just fade away." Just as the Korean War is ending, another major event occurs. Joseph Stalin dies in 1953. And so this evil dictator of the Soviet Union, this Russian dictator, dies. And now it's kind of like, well, what's going to happen? How are U.S. relations with Soviet Union going to change? Another thing that changes is Dwight D. Eisenhower, former general during World War II, is elected president to replace Truman. China and North Korea agree on a ceasefire, as they were afraid the United States might use nuclear weapons. And today, this war is still going on. It's not over. It's just a ceasefire. It's been a ceasefire since 1953. There's Dwight D. Eisenhower. There's Vice President Richard Nixon. We'll watch this video later. I thought I had a picture on here of MASH. Maybe not. If you've ever seen the TV show MASH, it's on reruns all the time. Pretty good show. Interesting thing about MASH. The show ran, it was about, sometimes people get confused and think it's a Vietnam, but it's about the Korean War. The show was on for over 10 years, about a medical unit during the Korean War. So the show's on for 10 years. How long did the war actually last? 1950 to 1953. So they made a 10-year show about a 3-year war. All right. McCarthyism. We talked a little bit about the House of Un-American Activities, the HUAC, and one of the leaders of this, the Congress, the committee, was Joseph McCarthy, and he was a congressman from Wisconsin, and who basically was out there preaching that there were communists everywhere. There were spies everywhere, Russian spies, and so he wanted to have trials, and he wanted basically to he was accusing people, other people were accusing people, and having all these big trials that could really hurt people personally and professionally. So they called this McCarthyism. Here's Joe McCarthy. See, Communist Party organization. They've got dots where there's different communist organizations set up. You see a couple here, one in the cities and one up on the Iron Range. And there was a communist party in the United States, a political party. And you got to remember, in the United States, we have freedom of religion, freedom of speech, right? And so is it technically illegal to be a member of the Communist Party? No. But they basically were trying to ruin people's lives if they were. And so McCarthyism was accusations and investigations of suspected communist activities in the United States during the 1950s. Many of these accusations were based on rumors. So this is the guy that led the whole thing, Senator from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy. Talked about this before, but the HUAC, this was set up to investigate communists in the United States. One of the places that they looked for communists was Hollywood. And they talked about the Hollywood 10. And these were members of Hollywood who were sent to prison and blacklisted as a result of HUAC. they couldn't get jobs. They couldn't they couldn't write movies anymore. They couldn't direct movies anymore. It really ruined their entire career. Nobody wanted to be associated with a known communist or people that may have um, be part of the Communist Party. And so not only were they looking for spies, but they were just kind of looking to try to wreck people's lives that they thought might be members of the Communist Party. The McCarran International Security Act gave the government the right to arrest and detain suspicious people that could be a threat to our country. And so if you were a known communist, you were supposed to register with the government so they could keep an eye on you. Truman vetoed that bill, but Congress overrode it, and so they had enough votes to do that. And you didn't want to be known as a person that went easy on communism. You think about it, if you're someone in Congress and you are saying, "Oh no, we're not we're gonna go easy on a communist." If you're in Congress, next time around, people aren't going to vote for you. That's a pretty big target on your back. And so nobody wanted to be the person that went easy on communism. Pretty good movie, The Majestic. Um, Jim Carrey he has like amnesia in the movie, and he was a Hollywood producer or a Hollywood director, and he ends up running a movie theater, but he ends up having to go through some HUAC trials. It's from the movie. You might have seen this movie. It's an old one, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. It was kind of based on this idea that there were communists and spies among us. And here it's about aliens, but the aliens can basically turn themselves into a person that you thought you knew. And it basically as people were paranoid and afraid that there were communists or spies around every corner, next thing you know, same thing here. You can't even tell if it's a spy or a communist, and or here it's an alien, and so it kind of preyed on people's paranoia at the time, and it was a pretty big hit. A lot of bad guys in movies after this are Russians. Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle. Sometimes you'll still see the cartoons on TV. Frostbite Falls was the town they lived in, and the bad guys in the movie were Russian spies. We talked a little bit about the Rosenbergs. They were convicted of selling U.S. secrets, atomic secrets, to the Russians, and they were sentenced to death. So a husband and wife accused of spying, and it's still up in the air whether they were actually guilty of it, but I think enough evidence has come out that they were, and they were sentenced to the electric chair in 1953. You can see a little propaganda here, America under communism. Our flag is burning. You've got these Soviets attacking us. And so this was a time that people were definitely worried about what was happening overseas and what could be happening at home. Next time, we'll talk a little bit more about the Eisenhower years as both the space race and the arms race get going.